Thank you to the PhilS4 seminar series for having me. Very excited to be here. I'll say maupay nga adlaw hatanan, or good day to everyone in the Waray language, since I'm sure we're all in different time zones right now. And I also wanted to start off by giving thanks to my research participants in Tacloban, who are all survivors of Supertyphoon Yolanda and the many typhoons that have happened there since. So this presentation is primarily in service to them, as well as all typhoon affected people in the Philippines. So this talk shows some of my central points in my dissertation research, which is an ethnography of infrastructure and an ethnography of disaster. So in November 2013, Supertyphoon Yolanda, also known internationally as Haiyan, made first landfall in the eastern Visayas of the Philippines. A total estimated 10,000 people died during the super typhoon. Most of these people were within the highly urbanized area of Tacloban City on the eastern coast of Leyte Island. And this amount of loss was not due to high winds and flying debris, as you might imagine, but rather to sudden and inescapable storm surges of seawater that deluged the coastal areas all across the central Philippine islands. The storm surges proved to be the deadliest aspect of the typhoon, yet it was the least communicated threat prior to landfall. And the repeating sentiment I encountered from affected people was that if the storm surge had been effectively communicated, many lives would have been saved. 3 years later, I arrived in Tacloban for my field research with the question of how low-income coastal residents in Tacloban use media and communication technologies. This is like radio, television, mobile phones, internet, to prepare for and survive the annual typhoons that cross there. Communication is an integral part of experiencing disaster. Residents of the Philippine Islands receive on average 19 typhoons every year, and life-saving alerts give affected people time to prepare for the oncoming typhoons, plus information about how to best prepare. Beyond that, media like television and radio help people interpret state-issued alerts to the public, or they also act as hotlines to answer questions. So while these alerts are produced with the expectation that the message will make its way to all residents equally, that's not really the case. Residents across the Philippines experience disaster communication in different ways according to their relationship to the infrastructures. This can be access to media, also their relationship to their local government, and a lot more. So this project asks, how do people experience the disaster media infrastructure differently or unequally? And also, how does infrastructural inequality affect the ability of people, their families, and their neighbors to survive and to respond to and survive a typhoon? My research shows how low-income coastal residents experience inequality within the disaster media infrastructure of the Philippines, and also examines the stakes involved for typhoon communication as a tool for survival. I will show how technologies and infrastructures for disaster communication that are meant to save can actually impede people's ability to survive a disaster. I'll review some of the conditions surrounding low-income coastal residents' experiences navigating disaster information through different communal, city, and national infrastructures for communicating disaster. I consider here first how people are marginalized by multiple infrastructures, then next the workarounds they devise to their marginalization, and then the connection of these situations to how people navigate disaster media infrastructures to survive. So from 2016 to 2018, I lived in Tacloban City for my field research. And during this time, I was introduced to members of a small neighborhood I'll refer to as San Jose Beach, but this is a pseudonym, as is all the pronouns and all the names in this presentation. I learned that prior to Typhoon Yolanda, this neighborhood was mostly composed of informal settlements and informally constructed homes, and these were all destroyed in the storm surges of Yolanda completely. Many people, many family members did not survive, but the survivors who lived here returned and lived here for an entire year on this land in a tent city. And then when I arrived, they had been living in this arrangement you see here of temporary homes, which was constructed by an NGO. They had been living in this arrangement for 2 years at the time. And they were not meant to be permanent residences. The families here were all on the wait list to secure a home in new relocation villages on the outer, more highland areas of the city. But most people wish to stay here near the sea, where many people relied on fishing for their income. So it made more sense not to move away from the sea. This is despite the fact, though, that San Jose Beach was considered one of the most vulnerable locations in the city to storm surges. I want to just briefly share some of the theories guiding my research. This work is theoretically anchored within 2 subfields of anthropology: ethnography of infrastructure and disaster anthropology. And so these are some of the framings you'll see reflected in the accounts that I shared today. First, that there's diversity in the social meanings of infrastructure. They might mean different things to different people depending on how they access it. And they also might be used in different ways. Infrastructures themselves can create collectivities in how people collectively use them. And then also, I want to bring into conversation disaster vulnerability. It's seen not as like the static part of people's identity, but more as fluid and multi-dimensional experiences that can change over time. And then last, the concept that disaster is unbounded temporally by the onset event. We often think of disaster as that moment when the typhoon makes landfall and causes destruction, but in disaster anthropology, we bring in the timeline far before the onset and also after to kind of understand what's happening in a disaster. So I'm going to start by talking about some of the government communications that happen locally and nationally. And the main theme here is the production of uncertainty. So on July 6, 2017, when I was there in Tacloban, a 6.5 magnitude earthquake with the epicenter located just in the mountainous center of the island hit. And I was in a cafe when the earthquake happened. My mug started rattling as the lights went out and the hanging light fixture above me started swinging back and forth. And the shaking felt long, even by my California native standards. It was about 20 to 30 seconds. It turned out that the earthquake was so strong that it immediately damaged and shut down the entire island's grid electricity system. And then it took almost 2 weeks to repair that afterward. The next day, I went to San Jose Beach to learn about people's reactions and responses to the earthquake to see if they're okay. On arrival, I approached a woman who I spoke with often, who I'll call here Ate, and she was sitting on the stoops of her neighbor's house talking with 2 other women. I asked if they were all right, and they were all right, but they were still nervous and shaken up. In San Jose Beach, there was no injuries or deaths from the earthquake, but there was a great fear of a tsunami following on the heels of the earthquake, which they knew could be a possibility if it's an earthquake that originates in the ocean. So Ate's first reaction to the earthquake was to run outside the house because she was nervous. She found that her neighbors were also out. What did they say? I asked. She told me chismes or chit chat, chica namsika or gossip. They said, relax, nothing will happen, pray. She then listened to her battery-operated radio for half an hour, hearing updates of damages in one city and landslides in another, all the while waiting to hear if there was a tsunami threat to Tacloban, until she finally received a text from the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council saying that there is no threat of tsunami. Her neighbor, who is also her friend, interjected us here and said that she received the text after 20 minutes. And so people noticed that they had sometimes received that national disaster emergency alert text at different times. And this shows to me that people do not uniformly receive emergency communications, even though that was the goal, to automatically enrolling all mobile users in the national emergency update system. It also showed me how useful that chismes was in sharing information when the emergency alert infrastructure failed for some people. Ate continued talking with her neighbors the day of the earthquake until 9 p.m. So she wasn't convinced that she was safe even all those hours after she got the alert that there was no tsunami. And even then, the day after when I visited, I saw that all the neighbors were still nervously talking still. The constant sharing of updates and information through talking was a major part of the disaster media infrastructure in this instance. And it's also one that we don't immediately bring to mind when we think of what disaster media infrastructure actually is. I'm going to share another resident reaction which stood out to me. He is a male in his late 20s who I sometimes talk to during my weekly English lessons. So I volunteered and gave children English lessons when I was there, and he would sometimes talk to me. I'll refer to him as Idoy. Idoy said that he was working when the earthquake happened and he felt dizzy and confused for a while. He was afraid that he was going to die. He got the national emergency text update that there was no tsunami 15 minutes after the shake. And then he decided to head home to San Jose Beach where he lived with his uncle. When he got there, about 6 family members and neighbors were there at the house listening to the solar radio for news altogether. Idoy was particularly passionate and vocal about San Jose Beach's needs from the local government. And this is an excerpt of what he told me. He said, "The question is about the government's update. There should be guidance from the city government or the barangay, like they should go around the neighborhood directly following the earthquake. It's like the city government or the barangay's captain responsible around on the barangay, that they remind us that be careful, and they remind us that if there was an earthquake, you were going to be careful with yourself and your family and all that." So it was like we were left in the dark. They didn't go around. We were dependent on the radio, dependent on the TV, dependent on the cell phone. They were missing or like reminding us. That's it. What they should do is ask everyone at each house, accompany them in their situations. They were just not here. That is the big question. Where's the barangay captain? Where's the barangay community? Where's the city government? Idoy's statement showed to me how uncertainty was produced for him through delayed and differing media updates from multiple sources, and from the barangay government's lack of leadership for those affected in San Jose Beach. For him, the government should have helped them make sense of the media updates, told them what they recommend officially, and asked what the people's needs are. So overall, media help to ease uncertainty in their own different ways, but they also, together with the failure of the barangay to communicate, produce uncertainty. This shows how disaster communications, although meant to be helpful infrastructures for risk reduction, actually lose effectiveness when they produce uncertainty this way, or it can increase risk by ineffectively communicating dangers. I'm going to also show here, talk about some of the different media technologies people use. So I show some of the ways that San Jose Beach residents were marginalized by media and communication infrastructures, and some of the workarounds they devised to enhance or fill in their media experiences. It's important for me to point out here that people in San Jose Beach had very different economic circumstances, and this translated into different access or non-access to media. Some of the most common workarounds to media access involve some forms of community within the neighborhood. Residents individually and together practice weather monitoring daily to get the earliest notice of storms and typhoons. I saw this even in the off season of typhoon season. People just monitored weather daily just in case. So it's important for me to explain also that disaster communication on the part of the audience looking for information happens long before there's even a hint of danger. So I'll first talk about radio. Radio was one of the most commonly used and easily accessible forms of media in San Jose Beach. Radio could be purchased inexpensively and required little energy to operate compared to television. Several households used solar-powered radios. Solar radios were attractive because they didn't require a paid energy source, but people encountered other challenges in using a solar radio, such as unreliable solar charging. So if the sun wasn't out, the radio didn't charge that day. Many more people owned or had access to a battery-operated radio rather than solar radio, but these were often reserved for emergency use because the batteries were so costly. During my surveys and interviews, when I asked if the participant used a radio, many times I heard the response, "We have a radio, but no batteries." One woman who responded this, for example, said that she had a radio, but had no batteries, but she listened to the radio news every morning from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. at a friend's house. And then I'll also share something about television. Only a few households had a television in San Jose Beach. I noticed that television watching was communal in different ways. It could be just with family members or with friends and neighbors too, often depending on the program. One woman expressed a sense of responsibility toward media sharing with her neighbors. She received her television as a gift from her employer after the temporary homes were constructed in San Jose Beach. So she was one of the first homes to have a television in the neighborhood. And she said that if there was something important on TV, she gave the example of former President Duterte's visit to Tacloban. She would invite her neighbors over to view the coverage. It's not just that people ask their neighbors and friends to share media access, but also that media owners offer access to people around them. It wasn't clear to me how much of the media sharing and other workarounds were reflective of life before Yolanda, but it was clear that everyone in San Jose Beach lost all their media technology, save for a very few surviving cell phones and radios. And they had to gain back all their media technologies that they lost afterwards. Some households built back their resources quicker than others, and these became main places media was shared and used communally. Media sharing happened between family, friends, and neighbors, often centered around certain programming, watching the news together or televised events. So that's all I'm going to share today. I'm just going to end off with some conclusions. So revisiting my research question, how do people use disaster media infrastructure to survive typhoons in the Philippines? I wanted to kind of illustrate this by first showing how people are marginalized by multiple infrastructures and looking at the workarounds to their marginalization. And then connect the connection of these situations to how people navigate disaster media infrastructures to survive. And some of the conclusions I showed were that disaster media infrastructure was used in a diversity of ways, often associated with people's economic circumstances, social networks, and more. Infrastructures can set the ground for community making, so people's engagement with disaster media infrastructure should be understood in its communal uses as well as its individual uses. And then when these aren't accounted for, disaster media infrastructure can produce uncertainty and fail for certain people and actually impede their ability to survive. So I'll leave it at that, and thanks for your attention.